The door should not have moved at all. It is a small postern in the northern run of the Theodosian walls, a wooden leaf swollen by weeks of rain and concussions, its iron bands bent like tired ribs. Every night someone has come along this stretch of damp stone, fingers gritty with mortar dust, and slid the bolt home. Tonight, in the last dark of May 29, 1453, no one has. A wall sentry, anonymous in every chronicle, leans his shoulder against it as he turns to shout something down the parapet. He feels the wood give half an inch. Not much. Just enough that the iron meets the strike plate with a soft, hollow click instead of a solid stop. His breath smells of stale wine and coppery fear. For a heartbeat, his hand rests on the bolt, this poor sliver of metal between a dying empire and the dawn. Below him, the long land front of Constantinople is a silhouette of angles and scars. The moat is a black ribbon, the outer wall a jagged line, the inner wall, 20 meters of brick and limestone patched with late Byzantine cement, is pitted from weeks of bombardment. Powder smoke from the night's firing hangs low and sour, clinging to wet stone. Out to the west the earth still trembles now and then with a lazy aftershock from Memphis' giant bombards, but the sustained hammering has stopped. The low thud that has stalked their sleep for days is gone. The guns are resting. So are the men. On the Ottoman side, scouts and junior agas move through their own pre-dawn gloom, counting torches, checking scaling ladders, fingering the damp cords of their bows. Somewhere behind them, Mehmed, 21 years old, wrapped in a cloak that smells of wool and lamp smoke, waits for reports. The final assault is timed for first light. His clock is simple, sunrise or humiliation. For Constantine 11 on the walls, the clock is crueler, a few more hours of darkness to rotate exhausted defenders, to plug breaches in stone and morale with too few men and too many prayers. The chain across the Golden Horn holds for now. The sea is their ally, the land is their wound. Command is fraying at the edges. Orders run along the parapet slower than fear. Someone was supposed to check every postern gate. Someone did not. A hand lingers on an unlatched bolt. Then let's go. This city has heard armies before. In 626, Avar horsemen and Persian engineers gnawed at these same defenses and failed. In the long, grinding sieges of 674, 678 and again in 717, 718, Arab fleets crowded the Sea of Marmara and the Bosporus, only to be burned back from the walls. In 1204, Crusaders, supposed fellow Christians, lashed their ships straight to the sea walls and clawed their way over. Again and again, invaders reached these stones and broke against them, like surf that never quite wears down the headland. So why this morning? Why this gate? How does a city that has outlived plagues, iconoclasts, civil wars, religious schisms, barbarians, caliphs, and crusading lords finally fail, in the unnoticed squeak of a swollen wooden door? That is our investigative question tonight. Not simply why Constantinople fell, but how it did not for so long. How did this one knot of streets and domes, this new Rome on the Bosporus, survive when every other Roman capital, Old Rome, Ravenna, Antioch, Alexandria, was peeled away? And why, after more than 1,000 years of not falling, does the pattern crack on a single dawn in 1453? On my desk in the archives of humanity lies one of our witnesses, a fragment of the Theodosian walls, no bigger than a brick, but heavy as an accusation. The surface is pale limestone, cross-hatched with lines where a mason's chisel bit and slipped 15 centuries ago. Threaded through it are thin courses of red brick, the Roman engineering signature, bonding stone to stone. Across one face there is a crescent-shaped scar where something slammed into it with enough force to shear the outer layer clean. Torsion artillery. The iron beak of a trebuchet stone. The blunt kiss of a 15th-century cannonball. I run a fingertip along a groove filled with later, coarser mortar, evidence of repairs after some forgotten quake or siege. The empire kept a permanent corps of masons and lime burners just to heal these wounds faster than enemies could reopen them. Each patch is a near-death scribbled into the city's skin. Each crack is a testimony under cross-examination. If you could slice this stone open in cross-section, you would see not just lime and sand but 1,100 years of decisions. Where to build, what to pay, whom to trust, when to gamble. Tonight, we will treat this fragment as a crime scene witness and a black box recorder. We will ask, which forces left the deepest marks, geography, engineering, gold, belief, or the city's own self-sabotage? Then we will widen the frame, from this one chipped block to the whole 5.7-kilometer defensive system that girdled Constantinople like a crown, and to the centuries of assaults, bargains, and betrayals encoded in its fabric. To understand why that unlatched gate mattered, we have to zoom out to the peninsula it pierced. Constantinople, as Byzantium before it, sits on a knife-shaped finger of land, poking between the Golden Horn to the north and the Sea of Marmara to the south, with its point aimed at the Bosporus, where Black Sea water squeezes past into the Mediterranean. This is geography as verdict, one city, controlling not just a harbor or a hinterland, but the maritime throat between continents. From the deck of a Roman Draman warship, hugging the current, you can see the logic immediately. Anchor your fleet here and a single chain stretched across the Golden Horn blocks a whole sheltered inlet. Add another squadron in the Bosporus and you can, in theory, choke off two seas with one hand, Black and Aegean. On the landward side, the calculus is just as merciless. Approach routes for large armies are limited, most of the Thracian plain funnels onto a broad, gently rising strip of ground west of the city. That is where Theodosius II's engineers chose to throw up the double, and eventually triple, line of walls that we still call Theodosian, though generations of unknown masons deserve the credit. If you are a geography maximalist, this is where you stop your analysis and light a cigarette. Of course the city survived, they say. Put a fortified peninsula at a naval choke point and the odds are stacked. Without total naval dominance and siege guns that can pulverize masonry, you are battering a cliff face with your fists. In this view, the Arab fleets of the 7th and 8th centuries, the Bulgar armies, the Rus raiders, even the early Ottomans, were doomed by the map as much as by any emperor. But the stone in my hand has counterarguments etched into it. Skeptics point to how many times that perfect position nearly killed the city. To be a choke point is also to be a magnet. Grain can come by ship when the hinterland is lost, but if the straits are blocked, the city starves behind its own harbor chain. The same narrow approaches that focus your defenses also focus every invading army straight at your heart. And geography did not prevent disasters in 1204 or 1453. The map was the same, the outcomes were not. Something else was in play, human decisions about ships, pay, politics, and faith. So geography offers us a baseline, a defensive credit line. It explains why Constantinople gets to play the long game at all. It does not, by itself, explain why the game lasts 11 centuries or why, in the end, the last check bounces. But geography alone never kept a city alive for 11 centuries. The fragment of wall we are interrogating tonight comes from the masterpiece of late Roman military engineering, the Theodosian walls, completed between about 413 and 447 CE. Stand on the glacis in the 10th century and look up, and you see a sequence of obstacles that feel almost unfair. First a moat, perhaps 20 meters across, sometimes flooded, sometimes a dry ditch bedded with sharpened stakes. Then a low outer wall with its own walkway and towers, a skirmisher's platform where defenders can rake the moat with arrows and ballista shots. Behind that, separated by a killing strip of ground, the main wall rears up, nearly 5 meters thick at the base, studded with towers that climb to 20 meters, built in that distinctive banded pattern, courses of pale limestone alternating with narrow runs of red brick, all fronting a dense, earthen rampart that soaks up shock like a sandbag. To build this required a functioning imperial machine. Quarries in Thrace and across the Marmara had to deliver stone on schedule. Brickworks fired night and day. Lime kills 8 forests. Thousands of laborers and specialized craftsmen worked in teams, racing a clock set not by Mem II but by earlier enemies and earthquakes. We know from chronicles that in 447, when a massive quake cracked and toppled long sections of the wall just as Attila the Hun was ravaging the Balkans, the city mobilized in panic. The imperial administration conscripted citizens en masse. Within something like 60 days, an almost unbelievable tempo in ancient construction, the walls were patched, towers rebuilt, ditches cleared. When Attila arrived, he found not welcoming gaps but a bristling, newly mended barrier. Infrastructure, here, is not background, it is emergency response. Some historians look at that episode and argue for a walls as superweapon thesis. In their reading, the Theodosian complex is equivalent to the atomic bomb or the aircraft carrier, a once-in-a-civilization investment that radically skews the balance of power. In late antiquity, when most cities still make do with stout but ordinary fortifications, Constantinople is ringed with something on another level, and that something is the central reason it survives while peer cities fall. But others push back. They point at 1204, when the Fourth Crusade breaches the sea walls with a combination of naval ingenuity and treachery, or at 1453, when the land walls are held by a garrison so thin that stretches go virtually unguarded. Walls, this camp insists, are force multipliers, not talismans. Without enough troops, without pay to keep them on the ramparts, without a political system that can mobilize and trust its own population, even the best fortifications merely slow an enemy down. A wall will not fix a broken empire, it will only make the breaking take longer. Our stone fragment carries another secret in its pores, the memory of fire. Not the random burning of torches, but the deliberate, engineered inferno of Greek fire. In the late 7th century, as Arab navies learned to challenge Rome on the sea, Byzantine engineers, perhaps drawing on Syrian or Alexandrian chemists, armed their Draman warships with bronze siphons that could spit a liquid flame. Chroniclers like Theophanes speak of Arab ships burning on the water, crews leaping into the sea only to find the flames clinging to the surface. No formula survives, the mixture was a state secret wrapped in oaths and compartmentalization. Modern reconstructions suggest a petroleum base, thickened with resins and perhaps fired with sulfur or saltpeter, pumped under pressure and ignited at the nozzle. Whatever the exact recipe, its psychological effect was as important as its physical one. Imagine yourself on the deck of a wooden galley at night, oars creaking, the wind carrying the smell of pitch and salt. Suddenly from the dark city ahead a jet of roaring orange arches out, hits your prow, and the world becomes a shrieking mix of heat and smoke. Many Arab chroniclers blame their failures at Constantinople in 674, 678 and again in 717, 718 on this infernal Byzantine weapon. Tech optimists have seized on Greek fire as proof that technology, properly leveraged, can overturn massive numerical disadvantages. In this reading, Constantinople's survival in the 7th and 8th centuries is a kind of naval Manhattan Project, an innovative weapon system, coupled with skilled crews and tight operational secrecy, that buys the empire breathing room it could not otherwise have afforded. But contextualists remind us of the other variables in those sieges, the long supply lines of the Arab armies, the brutal Balkan winters that chew through besieging camps, the logistical genius of emperors like Leo III in stockpiling grain and rotating garrisons. Greek fire, they argue, was not a magic wand but a vivid symbol of a broader competence in naval logistics and administration. Take away the stocks of timber, the trained sailors, the arsenals that build and maintain the fleets, and a siphon on the prow means very little. And, they note, by the 10th and 11th centuries, enemies have learned to respect and avoid Greek fire, its relative advantage erodes. There is no single technological trick that explains 1100 years of not yet. Even the strongest walls crack if the people behind them cannot afford to stand there. One of Constantinople's least glamorous but most decisive tools of survival was not stone or flame but gold, and the words wrapped around it. From at least the 6th century onward, the imperial court developed what we might call a professional diplomatic machine. There were trained interpreters who knew not just languages but tribal customs, scribes who could spin treaties into glittering performances, masters of ceremony who understood that making a Bulgar chieftain wait 3 days in an antechamber before granting him a title like patrician could have more battlefield effect than a skirmish on the frontier. In the Great Palace, envoys from the steppe or the caliphate were walked through halls heavy with incense and mosaics, shown mechanical marvels, bronze lions that roared, jeweled trees that chimed, to communicate a simple message: this city is too rich, too intricate to destroy. Better to take its gold and honors and go home. Hunnic leaders, Bulgar Khans, later Pecheneg and Rus princes received subsidies and court titles that flattered them into becoming, at least on parchment, friends of the emperor. Slavic and Georgian princesses married into the imperial family, Byzantine brides traveled north to Kiev. De Administrando Imperio, the handbook compiled by Constantine VII in the 10th century, reads in places like a field manual of manipulation: here is how you set one tribe against another, here is how you bribe this chieftain without offending that one. Admirers of this system see it as a high form of statecraft. Every bag of gold that changed hands instead of arrows is, in their view, a human life saved, a farm not burned, a son not conscripted. Strategically, buying time could be priceless: pay off the Huns this decade while you rebuild the Danubian forts, give Venetians trade concessions in exchange for their fleets this century while you hold the eastern frontier together. Empires with less administrative finesse might ride out onto the plain every time someone rattled a saber. Byzantium often chose to unstring the bow with a banquet and a crucible. Critics, both medieval and modern, call this by uglier names: appeasement, fiscal self-harm, addiction. They point out that the subsidies to steppe peoples could become enormous, that the habit of granting trade monopolies or tax exemptions to Italian cities like Venice and Genoa slowly hollowed out the empire's own commerce. In this reading, every treaty that made a foreign merchant richer made a local guild weaker, every concession to Venice in the 11th and 12th centuries was a mortgage on future sovereignty. Venice's privileged position in Constantinople's harbors is precisely what allows it, in 1204, to steer the Fourth Crusade into attacking the city that had fed it. The same golden instruments that once deflected barbarian raids eventually tuned an orchestra that played the empire off the stage. Underneath the ledgers and treaties, another force hums: story. Constantinople does not just exist, it believes things about itself. To its emperors and many of its people, it is not merely the capital of a surviving Roman state but the new Rome and the new Jerusalem combined. In the shadow of the Hagia Sophia's dome, floors slick with candle drippings and pilgrim dust, relics are displayed, alleged fragments of the true cross, saintly bones, holy garments. Coronations take place there, processions carrying icons and relics march along the walls in times of siege. Chronicles describe omens. In 626, the Virgin is said to appear on the ramparts, heartening defenders. In 718, visions of celestial riders are reported. In 1453, a mysterious light around the Hagia Sophia's dome is taken by some as a sign that the Holy Spirit is departing. One school of thought, let's call it the belief as weapon thesis, argues that this sacralized identity was itself a strategic asset. If your city is not just a political capital but the vessel of God's promise, you endure things for it that you might not endure for a mere administrative center. You go hungry longer during a siege. You accept heavier taxes for wall repairs. You drag yourself to the battlements again after 3 nights without proper sleep because to let this city fall feels like letting the world end. In this sense, theology seeps into logistics. The opposing view, the fatalism thesis, warns about the shadow side of being chosen. If you are convinced that prophecies guarantee your city's survival until the end times, perhaps you underinvest in gunpowder when it first appears. Perhaps you leave certain reforms undone because, surely, God will not let this bastion fall. On the eve of 1204 and again before 1453, we see emperors caught between harsh military facts and a populace steeped in stories of divine protection. Attempts to compromise with the Latin West, like the late Byzantine efforts to accept union with the Roman Church in exchange for aid, are denounced by many as betrayal. The city's myth about itself, in this telling, stiffens into a carapace that prevents necessary adaptation. Faith, which once braced men on the walls, becomes an argument for not changing the blueprints behind them. Sometimes, the hand that reached for Constantinople's throat was its own. The city that could outlast Arab fleets and Bulgar cavalry nearly dies in 532 not under foreign siege but under riot. The Nika riots begin as what we might too easily call sports hooliganism, factions in the hippodrome, blues and greens, angry at imperial tax policies and judicial decisions. But Constantinople is not a normal city, and its factions are not ordinary fan clubs. They are conduits of patronage, religion, and local grievance. Over the course of days, chanting in the arena turns into barricades in the streets. Fires leap from district to district. Much of the city center, including parts of the original Hagia Sophia, burns. Emperor Justinian, by some accounts, is ready to flee. The state's legitimacy feels as fragile as the charred beams collapsing around him. In this moment, a single speech in a palace chamber may save the city. Empress Theodora, a woman from the margins who has clawed her way to the throne, reportedly declares that royal purple makes a fine burial shroud, that to run now would be worse than to die. Whether her exact words are accurately recorded or not, something in that mold is said and heard. Justinian stays. Troops loyal to him, including the fearsome General Belisarius, are unleashed on the hippodrome. They trap the rioters where they had chanted triumph, then slaughter them by the tens of thousands. Blood pools on the sand where chariots once raced. In the short term, imperial authority is reasserted, the city is saved. In the long term, one can argue both ways. Was this ruthlessness the necessary cauterization of a wound, or did it deepen a pattern where emperors treat their own populace as a besieging army? Fast forward 5 centuries and the city's greatest threats are again internal fractures, not just external forces. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, succession struggles and civil wars become almost a rhythm. Komnenoi, Angeloi, Palaeologi, dynasties rise and fall in palace coups, often inviting in foreign muscle. A disaffected prince calls on Turkish beyliks for aid, trading fortresses in Asia Minor for a chance at the purple. Another faction courts Western crusaders. Each invitation brings new players to the table, each gift of territory or privilege pries off another tile from the imperial mosaic. In 1203-1204, this internal game collides with the grand theater of the Crusades. The Fourth Crusade, initially aimed at Egypt, is diverted to Constantinople in part because a deposed Byzantine prince, Alexios IV Angelos, promises the Crusaders and their Venetian backers enormous sums and church union if they restore him. Structuralists argue that this tragedy was long in coming, decades of bad blood between Latin West and Orthodox East, economic rivalries with Venice, the memory of massacre of Latins in 1182, all setting the stage. Contingentists counter that without Alexios IV's desperate deal, without the Venetians' heavy hand on the rudder of Crusader logistics, without a few disastrous miscalculations inside the city, the unthinkable, Latins breaching and sacking Christian Constantinople, might not have happened. When the Crusaders finally assault, they do not come where the Theodosian land walls are strongest. They lash their ships together under the sea walls along the Golden Horn, using masts as makeshift siege towers. Venetian mariners, motivated partly by debt, partly by a chance to break a trading rival, lead boarding actions. On sections of the wall left thinly manned due to political chaos, Latin soldiers gain footholds. Fires are set, panic spreads. For 3 days, the greatest city in Christendom is looted by supposed allies. The relics are parceled out to Western cathedrals. The imperial palaces are stripped. A Latin empire is proclaimed, while Greek successor states scatter to Nicaea, Epirus, Trebizond. The sack of 1204 is a fracture from which the empire never fully recovers. Even when Greeks retake Constantinople in 1261, the new Palaeologan state is a diminished thing, poorer, more fragmented, with key ports in Italian hands and Anatolian heartlands eroded by Turkish advance. The walls still stand, but behind them the fiscal and demographic engine that once powered armies and fleets is coughing. For the next 2 centuries, emperors rule a city that is at once glorious symbol and rotting core, patching budgets with ever more desperate loans and concessions. By the spring of 1453, the long experiment of not falling was running on fumes. Mehmed II, young, ambitious, and well-read in both Islamic and Byzantine history, understands that taking Constantinople is not just a strategic move but a civilizational gesture. He assembles a multi-ethnic host, Anatolian Turks, Balkan levies, Janissaries drawn from Christian-born boys, and, crucially, a fleet. To close the city's last great advantage, he has already built Rumeli Hisar, a fortress bristling with cannon on the narrowest point of the Bosporus, throttling Black Sea grain routes. Romano's heirs in Constantinople can no longer depend on ships from Trebizond or the Ukraine slipping past hostile shores. Mehmed's artillery train includes enormous bombards cast by Urban, a Hungarian gun founder who, according to some accounts, had first offered his services to the Byzantines but found their treasury inadequate. The largest pieces are as much theater as weapon, they take hours to load, belch projectiles that shatter on impact as often as they shatter stone, and yet their psychological and cumulative effect is new. Day after day, sections of the land wall, especially around the Lycus Valley, are pounded. Dust fills cisterns. Stones that have shrugged off centuries of arrows now jump under metal and gunpowder. Inside the city, the garrison is pitifully small for the task, perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 fighting men, including a contingent of well-armed Genoese under Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. They triage the walls, concentrating strength at likely attack points, leaving other sections, like the area near the small postern of Kirkoporta, thinly held. The hinterland that once fed legions is gone, tax farms have withered, the empire is, in effect, a city-state with imperial titles. Yet the old pattern tries to assert itself. When early bombardments punch holes in the walls, Constantinople answers with its ancient reflex, repair. Men and women haul stones, fascines, and earth in the night to plug breaches. The earth rampart behind the masonry, that old Roman backup plan, absorbs and redistributes shock. On some days, Ottoman assaults are repelled with heavy loss. The idea that the city can still do this one more time seems, for a moment, plausible. Historians argue passionately over the decisive factors in this last siege. Gunpowder enthusiasts point to the erosion of the walls under sustained cannonade. Even if each shot only chips away, the cumulative effect over weeks turns once smooth curtains into battered steps easier to climb, and constant trauma eats at defender morale. Skeptics answer that most of the truly huge bombards were inaccurate and slow, that many medieval sieges ended in assault without any cannons at all. In their view, numbers, discipline, and Mehmed's willingness to innovate mattered more. Consider one such innovation. When the chain across the Golden Horn seems unbreakable, Mehmed has ships dragged overland on greased logs from the Bosporus into the sheltered waters behind the city's northern walls. It is a logistical stunt and a psychological blow. Suddenly the defenders must stretch their tiny force even further, watching sea walls they had not expected to fight on. Or look at the Ottoman practice of keeping fresh assault troops in reserve while sending irregulars and vassals in the first waves, wearing down the defenders' stamina and ammunition. This is not simply a horde, it is a learning, adapting machine. On the Byzantine side, key turning points come like snapped bowstrings. Giustiniani, that Genoese captain, is gravely wounded during one of the climactic assaults near the St. Romanus Gate. Whether he is hit by arrow, shot, or fragment of stone, sources differ. What matters is that he asks to be taken from the wall. Many of his men go with him. For Byzantine chroniclers, this is a moment of betrayal, for others, a human soldier's limit reached. In any case, the gap in leadership and manpower at a critical sector is real. And then there is Kirkoporta, our unlatched gate. Some modern scholars doubt the story's details. The account comes mainly from later Byzantine writers like Doukas, who may have shaped memory into parable. But the plausibility is chilling. In the chaos of shifting units and overnight repairs, a small postern used by sorties or work gangs is left open or badly secured. Ottoman scouts probing the line find it. A handful slip through, scramble up to a tower, plant a banner. Suddenly, from the defender's perspective, there are enemy soldiers inside the line, behind them on the parapet. Panic, always the real enemy of fortified defense, ignites. Those who look up and see the wrong flag flying conclude, perhaps prematurely, that the walls are comprehensively taken. They abandon positions that were, in fact, still defensible. A local mistake propagates into a global collapse. Was this door, this single oversight, literally the breach point that doomed Constantinople? Or is it, as some argue, a convenient symbol for a fall that was overdetermined by demographics, economics, and geopolitics? The debate is not academic nitpicking, it cuts to how we understand collapse. One narrative says, the empire fell because of centuries of corruption, mismanagement, and social decay, Mehmed merely harvested a withered fruit. Another says, even a battered, diminished Constantinople might have continued to survive in some form, had not a confluence of new technology, exceptional leadership on the Ottoman side, and contingent missteps like Giustiniani's withdrawal and the Kirkaporta oversight aligned. In other words, was 1453 justice, or was it physics? When you stack these centuries like layers of brick, patterns begin to show through the mortar. Geography gave Constantinople a defensive baseline, a peninsula and a chokepoint strait are gifts that kept on giving. But geography alone did not save it in 717, 718, when snow and famine gnawed at the Arab besiegers while Greek fire gnawed at their fleets. Engineering, the walls, the earth ramparts, the moat, created a fortress that could turn arithmetic into agony for attackers. Yet those same walls could be leapt in 1204 when political chaos left them thinly manned, and pummeled in 1453 when the treasury could not fund enough gunpowder or mercenaries. Greek fire was a shock weapon that, for a time, made the imperial navy a terror at sea. But its advantage eroded as enemies adapted and as the empire's industrial base shrank. Diplomacy and gold bought time. They turned Huns into clients, Venetians into allies of convenience, Rus princes into Christian godsons. Each decade purchased in this way allowed a generation to live and die without seeing the walls fall. But every concession carried a hidden interest rate, tax breaks for Italian merchants that crippled local traders, tribute that normalized dependence, titles that cheapened the currency of imperial honor. Ideology made the city larger than itself. Being the new Rome, the new Jerusalem, sustained morale in grinding wars, icons on the rampart steadied hands on spear shafts. Yet the same conviction of chosenness could harden into a refusal to see that the world had changed, that cavalry raids had become cannonades, that Latin Christendom was not a reliable shield, that compromise, however distasteful, might be the only path. The emerging blueprint is not a single superweapon or an unrepeatable miracle. Constantinople's true superpower was its ability to constantly switch survival strategies as circumstances changed, naval when it had shipyards and chemists, diplomatic when its gold outshone its swords, ideological when faith could stiffen a starving populace, and military when emperors like Leo III or the Komnenoi could field competent armies. Its resilience lay in diversification. It did not bet everything on walls, or fire, or treaties, or prophecy. It played all of them, in different combinations, for 1,000 years, until, at the end, too many of those instruments were out of tune at once. But that kind of long game has a cost, and the ledger is stained. Every century of survival meant taxes, often crushing, to pay for garrisons and wall repairs. Peasants in Anatolia and Thrace hauled grain and coin to feed soldiers and bureaucrats they would never see. When plagues hit, and they did, repeatedly, those same regions were scoured again for manpower to refill the capital, for forced relocations to repopulate neighborhoods emptied by death or war. Provincial elites, squeezed to fund imperial projects, looked for exits. Some drifted into the orbit of rising powers like the Seljuks and later the Ottomans, others plotted at home. Economically, deals that seemed clever in one decade looked corrosive in another. Granting Venetian merchants reduced customs duties on the Bosporus might secure a fleet for a war against the Normans, but over generations it starved local shipbuilders and traders. Allowing Genoa to establish a colony at Galata across the Golden Horn injected capital and maritime muscle into the city's bloodstream, and created a rival lymph node that could, and did, act against Byzantine interests. The empire survived crises by externalizing costs to its future self. Religiously and culturally, attempts to patch alliances tore at social fabric. Iconoclasm in the 8th and 9th centuries, fueled in part by military and theological debates, set emperor against monk, soldier against icon painter. Much later, the attempts at church union with Rome to gain Western aid against the Ottomans split society. Some saw accepting the Pope as blasphemy worse than Turkish rule, others saw it as bitter medicine for survival. Each controversy left scars of distrust that made collective action harder when the guns began to speak. We can mark 3 nodes where resilience and fragility trade places. In 532, during the Nika riots, the system nearly snaps. The same city that can engineer aqueducts and domes finds itself unable to control its own factions. But decisive, if brutal, leadership clamps down. Theodora's hard words, the army's harsher steel, reset the equation. The cost is terrible, tens of thousands dead, but the message is, the center will hold, whatever it takes. In 717, 718, during the Great Arab Siege, we see Constantinople at peak adaptive capacity. Emperors combine tools, walls that deflect storming ladders, a navy that wields Greek fire, a strategy that lets winter and underfed horses do their own killing. They use the Bosporus as both shield and sword. Diplomacy with the Bulgars squeezes the Arab army from behind. The city survives, and in doing so preserves, for a time, the Christian East and the administrative traditions that will shape later states. In 1204, something more fundamental gives way. Diplomacy fails not because it was inherently flawed but because its premises have changed. Venetian commercial interests and crusader debts twist what should have been a negotiation among Christians into a zero-sum plunder. The walls are still strong, but the political class behind them is fractured, unpopular, and hapless. The same ceremonial splendor that once impressed barbarians now looks, to crusaders who have trudged across Europe, like hollow ostentation. Prestige that once bought security now paints a target. When the Latins go over the walls, they are breaching not just stone but the city's narrative about itself. After 1204, the empire's body is put back together, but some bones heal crooked. The recovered Constantinople of 1261 is a shadow of the 10th century metropolis, its population smaller, its tax base eroded, its armies more dependent on mercenaries. The Theodosian walls remain, but increasingly they are like an heirloom armor on a malnourished body. From the outside, impressive, from the inside, chafing and heavy. When cannon arrive in the 15th century, they are not so much the slayers of an immortal city as the examiners of a patient long in decline. So we must ask, in our own moral ledger, was the miracle of Constantinople's longevity a triumph of human ingenuity and cooperation, a feat of civilization holding the line against chaos, or was it, in another light, a very long, very expensive delay of the inevitable? How many lives were spent in the hope that the city would not be the one to fall, even if some city, somewhere, always does? If you trace your finger along a modern map, Constantinople is still exerting pressure on your hand. The Bosporus and the Dardanelles remain strategic choke points. In the First World War, British and French fleets hammered at the Dardanelles in a grim echo of Arab ships in the Sea of Marmara, and Turkish guns replied from concrete fortifications that are spiritual descendants of the Theodosian line. Today, Istanbul, same ridges, same waters, sits at the edge of NATO, a bridge and a fault line between alliances and cultures. Tankers loaded with Russian or Azeri oil move through the straits under conventions and treaties whose logic would have been instantly intelligible to a 10th century Byzantine admiral: control this narrow, and you influence entire regions. In religion and identity, the city's fall in 1453 still reverberates. For many Greeks, the date is a wound, the beginning of Turkocratia, a symbol of loss that colors national narratives. For many Turks, Mehmed's conquest is a foundational myth of statehood and faith, a moment when Islam plants its flag in the old Roman heart. For Orthodox Christians across Eastern Europe, the memory of Constantinople's patriarchate and liturgy shapes church politics and cultural pride. Prophecies, some medieval, some modern inventions, speak of the city changing hands again, of emperors returning. Conspiracy theories in our own century about Western plots in the Middle East sometimes reach back, explicitly or not, to 1204 and 1453. The far past is not an anecdote, it is a gravitational field. Even in law and administration, Byzantine fingerprints persist. Justinian's codification of Roman law influenced not only later civil law traditions in Europe but also the legal cultures of Orthodox countries. Bureaucratic habits, the careful keeping of tax registers, the professionalization of diplomatic corps, the idea that the state can outlast dynasties, live on in the DNA of modern institutions from Athens to Moscow to Ankara. Look around you now, and you will see modern states performing their own versions of Constantinople's balancing act. Great powers rely on geography as if it were the Theodosian walls reincarnated, oceans for the United States, mountains for China and India, depth of steppe for Russia. We speak of strategic depth and buffer zones, as if distance were still a moat against missiles and malware. Financial systems act as Greek fire in suit and tie, sanctions and access to global payment networks used to burn adversaries' economies without a shot fired. Diplomacy by banking replaces subsidies in coin. National myths and ideologies, stories of chosenness, manifest destiny, civilizing missions, are deployed to hold societies together under strain. People are asked to accept austerity, conscription, surveillance, or sacrifice because their nation is more than a normal polity, it is, like old Constantinople, a linchpin in some cosmic or historical plan. At the same time, internal divisions, partisan hatreds, culture wars, regional resentments, gnaw at legitimacy from within, like Nika riots waiting for a spark. The warning from 1453 is not that walls always fail or that gunpowder always wins, but that complex systems can absorb shock after shock for centuries and then unravel in what looks, to the eyewitness, like a single morning's catastrophe. The Kirkaporta legend, even if embroidered, offers a powerful metaphor. It is rarely the most imposing wall that fails first. It is the side door nobody has checked in years because the city has never fallen before. The underfunded public health lab. The outdated software that controls the power grid. The quiet, ignored treaty clause that allows a rival access to a key harbor. Constantinople was not a miracle that defied history, it was history in slow motion. Its fall does not prove that resilience is futile, it proves that resilience without renewal curdles into fragility. You can diversify your defenses, but if you fund them by draining the future, one dawn you will find that the bombards have been rolling toward you for decades while you repaired the same crack in the same wall. Join the investigation, and you begin to see echoes everywhere. A global financial network that we treat as unbreachable, protected by regulations, central banks, and digital walls, is perhaps a very old fortification with new paint, vulnerable to a technological artillery we have not yet fully imagined. Data centers, the vaults of our age, cluster in a handful of geographic choke points, undersea cables landing on a few crowded shores, server farms near cheap power and cool air. Alliances we speak of as eternal, security pacts, trade blocs, depend on the willingness of future taxpayers to fund them and of future citizens to believe in them. These are our moats, our walls, our Greek fire, our golden bribes. So here is the verdict I would enter into the record: every society builds its Constantinople, a structure of defenses, stories, and deals meant to keep chaos outside and meaning inside, and every society is tempted to believe that this time, unlike all the others, the walls will hold forever. As a mirror to the present, this story matters because it shows how long forever lasts, about 1,000 years, give or take, and then one bad season, one new technology, one missed gate. The lesson is not despair but vigilance wedded to humility. We cannot assume that our oceans, our algorithms, our stockpiles, our sacred texts, or our clever treaties will save us in every configuration of the future. We can, however, do what Constantinople did at its best: diversify our defenses, repair quickly, tell stories that inspire sacrifice without blinding us to change, and, crucially, keep walking the line of our own walls, checking every bolt. I would invite you, as fellow detectives in this archive of human experiments, to push this investigation further. Join the investigation by asking, where, in our world, are the great bombards already firing against structures we have not updated since the last crisis? Which of our alliances are brilliant 10th century treaties about to meet a 13th century crusade? Where are we relying on a weapon or technology we barely understand, like Greek fire, as if it will always terrify our adversaries and never leak beyond our control? Consider 5 minutes from this city's life we could lift out as individual cases. 1. A Greek fire siphon spluttering to life on the prow of a drahman as Arab ships bear down, an engineer praying his seals hold. 2. A foreman on the Theodosian walls in 447, hands raw from stone dust, racing an earthquake and Attila's scouts to get a section rebuilt before horsemen appear on the horizon. 3. Theodora in the palace, gaze steady, telling a roomful of frightened men that she will not live to see the day when she is not called empress, and in that moment, stiffening a spine that keeps the city from imploding. 4. A Venetian notary in a candlelit room, drafting the contract that steers the Fourth Crusade toward Constantinople, pen scratching like a quiet pick at the foundations of an empire. 5. Mehmed watching oxen drag ships over greased timbers toward the Golden Horn, turning the city's own geography against it with a single, audacious order. Each of these instances, viewed alone, is a story. Together they point back to the core thesis we have traced: survival by changing the rules, until the rules change faster than you can. Now the legacy question, the one no search engine can answer for you: if you were standing on that wall by Kirkaporta, in your own life, in your own institution, the night before the final assault, what would you recognize as your unlatched gate? Is it a habit you have justified for years, a vulnerability you assume no one will notice, a dependency on a story about yourself that has not been updated since childhood? And when you feel the wood move under your hand, will you slide the bolt home, call for help to reinforce it, or, like so many before you, tell yourself that dawn is still far off and the city has always survived?